Hello, and welcome back to the channel. For this video, I've decided to rank the albums by a band I've been meaning to cover in greater detail for a while, the rock/power pop group Badfinger. It's a name you often hear when people examine the more tragic side of rock music history, and rightly so. Conversely, it's also a name you often hear in association with the Beatles, something the band members themselves weren't fond of hearing, despite their early history being so intertwined with the Beatles in their final years together. For those of you who don't know, here's a brief overview. The band was originally called the Ivies when they were picked up by Apple Records, the new record label that the Beatles launched in the late 60s. After changing their name to Badfinger, the band had a successful string of hit singles going into the early mid-1970s. Unfortunately, highly questionable management dogged the band as their star rose, and by the mid-70s the band was broke, financially. This tragically led to guitarist Pete Ham committing suicide, as well as decades of litigation. A brief attempt to revive the band was undertaken in the late 70s, but it didn't last before the lingering problems split them up once again, with band member Tom Evans also committing suicide, partly over being haunted by Pete Ham's death. The band's unfortunate legacy tends to overshadow the music itself, which I think is definitely in need of reappraisal. So I've decided to rank their albums. This will be their core studio albums, both during their classic period and the brief reunion of the late 70s, early 80s. Bear in mind, as always, that this is my opinion, not yours. Here we go. Number 10, Maybe Tomorrow. This is the only album here that was released under their Ivies name. I actually got a hold of this well after collecting the other albums. It was only released in Japan, Italy, and West Germany, seeing as the planned UK and US releases were shelved for reasons that are still debated to this day. Regardless, this probably worked in the band's favor given the album's poor sound mix. And given most of the songs here appeared on their first Badfinger album, Magic Christian Music, my opinion is largely based on the album tracks that weren't carried over, even if I have them in better sound quality as bonus tracks on my copy of the follow-up album. The only two songs that really stand out to me are Sally Blue and I've Been Waiting. By and large, I'd call this album skippable. Number 9, Airwaves. With the band loosely rebuilt around Tom Evans and Joey Molland, one can say this barely qualifies as a Badfinger album. They only adopted the name for marketing power, and it ultimately opened old wounds for the band members. That being said, how does this album compare? To be honest, its slick production seems pretty close to what the band would have sounded like if the classic lineup were still together, despite contemporary reviews calling the album's production out for its West Coast flavor. In all, it's not a bad album, it just doesn't make much of an impression. Number 8, Badfinger. I always find it a little odd when a band releases a self-titled album and it's not their debut. In this case, it's also a reminder that the proposed album title, For Love or Money, was rejected by Warner Brothers Records, which is a shame. The album has some solid songs on it, but they weren't given the limelight that they should have been given at the time. Lonely You definitely should have been issued as a single, but it wasn't. To me, this album unfortunately shows a lot of missed potential. Number 7, Say No More. With a more stable lineup than its predecessor, this album also has a more rock-heavy feel. I think it definitely shows that the band still had some potential, but sadly the fractures between Evans and Molland grew further, and the band broke apart not long after. Who knows how things would have been had they stuck together a little longer. Number 6, Magic Christian Music. This one has an odd album title for several reasons. Casual listeners will see it and assume it's a Christian rock album. It's not. And people familiar with Apple Records' labeling tendencies will assume it's a full soundtrack album. But only 3 of the songs actually appear together in a movie, the 1969 satire film The Magic Christian, starring Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr. The songs, many of them brought over from the partially cancelled Maybe Tomorrow album, definitely benefit from the long gestation period and better sound mixing. While the band's still clearly trying to find its own direction and there's a lot of Beatlesque pop to go around, it's a promising start. Number 5, Ass. With the band's time at Apple Records coming to a close, this album's development was heavily stretched out, and it ended up released mere months before their first album with Warner Brothers Records, which in turn was also delayed because of this. The album's artwork is a perfect illustration of what the band was going through at the time, heading off into the sunset to pursue what they'd hoped would be greener pastures beyond the collapse of Apple. Guitarist Joey Molland is the dominant songwriter here, and the album's tone greatly shifts from song to song. The opening and closing tracks, both written by Pete Ham, definitely provide the most emotional moments. Number 4. Head First. This album is a strange look at what happens when a band finds themselves in turmoil with their management. By this point, the band had become aware of Stan Pauly's money schemes, but were in no position to get out of it. So they put their frustration into some of the songs. Sadly, with the arrival of a lawsuit from Warner over missing money, they weren't able to release this back in the mid-70s, and litigation held up its release until 2000, making it their final album. Musically, it's actually pretty good. While not as strong a set of songs as Wish You Were Here, it's still very much in the vein of both its immediate predecessor and Straight Up. Number 3. No Dice. Here we have the first true Badfinger album and the debut of the band's classic lineup. Despite the band's disdain for being compared to the Beatles, I'd have to agree that this album really does sound like what the Fab Four might have put out, were they still together at this point. It's quintessential power pop. Every song works, and there's no filler. The only oddity is the fact that their original version of Without You actually was released after Harry Nilsson's hit version, given it's a mix and match of two unfinished songs written by the band. Number 2. Straight Up. This is the definitive Badfinger classic, which is odd given that it was a compromise album. The band had initially recorded a quick follow-up to No Dice in between tour dates, but the proposed tracks were initially rejected by Apple. Both George Harrison and Todd Rundgren got involved with the production, and the end result became what I would call their most polished work. There's a greater emphasis on pop ballads, but the band maintains a strong energy throughout. It represents the band at the peak of their career. Number 1. Wish You Were Here. What could be argued to be the band's best overall work is sadly overshadowed by the fact that it was only on shelves for around 7 weeks, before the Warner Brothers Records lawsuit stopped everything. On the other hand, what became a prelude to the tragedy that consumed the band has earned a great deal of reappraisal on its own over the decades that followed. This album to me represents the band at their most creative. You have the Abbey Road medley-esque approach of 2 sets of partner songs, the bilingual charm of No One Knows, and the heartfelt bit of parental guidance that is Dennis. If you're planning on listening to the band's music in great detail, do not pass this album up. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for listening.